Well, I've been looking forward to this morning, and you'll all recall, I think it was March 25th when all of us were watching the news and George Floyd's tragic death was all over not only Minneapolis, but it went worldwide and caused a huge reaction in our city in all dimensions of that. And the question came to us, to all of us, as men and women, and to all the churches, what are you going to do about this? How are you going to respond to this? And that's a big question, and it's an ongoing question. But one of the ways that I find as that God is having us respond is to re-up and re-emphasize what we've always been doing, which is to make more and deeper disciples of Jesus Christ. Because it's Christ who tears down the barriers. It's Jesus who levels the playing field. It's Jesus who cut the curtain in half that divided the Gentiles from the Jews and ended all racism. But we're still the living church that's trying to live that out. So that statement of doing what we've always been doing is not a statement of status quo. It's a statement of being a learning organism, of people who are leaning into, well, what does God have to tell us today? What do I need to apply? How does my mind need to change? How does my vision need to be enlightened? That's what that means. It doesn't mean, well, we've always been right. We've always been correct. We've always gotten our doctrine correctly. No, it means how do we live in this current situation, and how do we open our eyes as a predominantly white church, a white culture, to things that we don't see very well. And so one of the proactive things that we're doing in this session of Ironworks is we're talking about God has His people. And the point is that there are many places that I can't go. It's not that I'm forbidden to go, but it's just I would not be received. I haven't earned the ticket. I don't speak the language. I'm not part of that culture. I'd like to speak into some of these things, but I don't have anybody to yell at. I don't have anybody to write to. If I leave a voicemail, I know it's not going to make any difference. But the joy I have is that God has His people already in the system who are Christ followers who have a voice. And that's why we're doing these interviews, and that's why we're doing this teaching in this session of Ironworks. And so this morning, I want to introduce you to someone who has a voice in a place that you've probably never thought of, who has a voice fighting for some justice that you probably don't think about. I certainly didn't until I talked with her. So I want to introduce to you Helen Lockett-L. Helen is a very brave woman to come to know this morning. Come on, Helen. Thank you for being here this morning, coming from Minneapolis in the early morning and being a part of our men's group. You are a very brave woman to be here, and I hope you feel welcome and relatively safe with all these men. I met Helen, I don't know how many years ago, 15 years ago. I presided at her wedding. She's married to Jesse, and we disinvited Jesse this morning so that he wouldn't make any noise. No, no, not really. Yeah. So, but a lot of us know Jesse, but I had really never had a conversation with Helen until a few months ago, and we were sitting across the table, and I thought, this is a woman of some substance, and she has a voice and she has something to say. And so even though she's quieter than Jesse, I think she has a lot of authority in what she has to say. So this morning, Helen, I want to just chat with you and ask you some things from your perspective. And so first of all, we want to just find out how you got to here. So give us a quick summation of your journey in life to get to this place in life.
Good morning. I'm originally from Jamaica and migrated to the United States in '69. and finished school here, undergrad at University of Minnesota in biology.
And went to Central High School, right?
Yes, Minneapolis
Yeah.
Central, yes. And the undergrad in biology, and then went on to Master Divinity at Luther Seminary, and clinical pastoral education and a residency at Hennepin. Worked as a chaplain. Prior to seminary, I worked as a surgical pathologist assistant at the University of Minnesota.
And I didn't know what that meant when you said that. I thought, do surgeons have pathologies, or what does that mean, surgical pathology?
Surgical pathology is the study of the tissue after it's removed if you went into and had a tumor, it would come to pathology where it's examined and looked at microscopically to determine the type of tumor it is and help the physician determine the type of treatment. So I did that for several years.
So your background is really, your major vocational background is in science.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
And then you went on to seminary. Why did you do that? Why would anybody go to seminary?
Yeah,
It's guaranteed for a low-income job. No.
Yeah. Jesse called it cemetery.
Yeah.
After accepting Christ in sophomore year of college, I then struggled with a call on my life, and I was heading for medical school, not seminary. And in the midst of that, had the audacity to challenge the Lord and said, okay, if this is the path you want me to take, then please show me. And in about when I said that prayer, in a week I received a scholarship and full scholarship to Luther Seminary, and as an ecumenical student. And I think that was an answer.
Yeah, Lord, show me a sign. Wow,
Yes,
that's tremendous. So I want to get to that in a minute, because God has woven together your science background and some things. What are some things you discovered about your gifting, as you became a Christ follower, went to seminary? What did you discover God was leading you toward? What's kind of the heartbeat of your soul for that?
Yeah. Well, one of the things is after seeking the Lord and trying to determine what path I should take, one of the things that came to me was that I need to bring comfort to others. And because of that, I ended up in chaplaincy, in crisis ministry, did a residency as I mentioned, at Hennepin County Medical Center, and then worked as a chaplain there, and also a chaplain on-call chaplain at Regents Hospital for some time. And then I've always been close to the community, because I think it's important for a church to be outside the walls. And so I got involved in the community and started off at what is now North Point Wellness Center, but it was North Point, one of the clinics there, working with teens in teen pregnancy prevention. And from there went to Stair Step Foundation, where I worked with on health disparities with the with about 25 or more African American churches, talking about health.
I'll bet none of us have ever heard of any of those organizations. And we have probably not heard the term health disparity. We're going to get back to that.
Okay.
Let's come back to that. But let's circle back, because you're an African-American woman, and I'm curious how that has affected you in our culture. How have you yourself felt bias or racism in different nuances or overt things in your life, Helen?
Well, moving to this country, I recall I moved here, I arrived on the 16th of July of 1969, and on the 17th of July, my aunt was working at Munsonware. For people who have been here long, for some time, they may remember Munsonware. And I took the bus. They gave me instruction, took the bus, and went to meet her for lunch. And my first experience was, and that I won't forever forget, because it's just...
And how old were you at the time?
15.
Okay.
Yeah. Don't do the math.
Yeah. That's too big a number. I mean, no.
Yeah, and I remember a woman coming down the steps. I was walking up the steps towards the door, and she pulled her children away like I had leprosy. And I mean, that was the first time for me that I felt, oh, what's different about me? Why somebody would react that way, and the way she looked at me. And for me, I was a teen, early teen, to have that experience. But over the years, as I have lived here, I've seen where if I experienced that as a teen, just think of kids, you know, when they go to school, they're experiencing that much earlier in kindergarten. And, you know, I know of several instances where kids were in kindergarten or in the first grade. And one incident, my friend told me about her nephew. This little boy would just scream when this other student came next to him, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. Come to find out, Mom had instructed him, when anyone black came next to you, you were supposed to scream. And just think how that impacted a little 6-year-old. Mm-hmm. So, yes, over the years, as I have journeyed through, there are times over and over again when you're watched in stores. I mean, one of the things, I go to the store, I never leave without a receipt. You may not think anything of it, but I never leave without a receipt, because I don't want someone to say that I took it. And whether I'm in you stop at the gas station and get a bag of chips or whatever. You want your receipt? Oh, can I have my receipt, please? I don't leave without that. So those are things sometimes you automatically start doing. But yeah, that one incident, though, made me know that in this country, your skin color made a difference. And then from there on, I began to see more things that I experienced over the years.
So it's a sense of being watched?
Yes.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Now, of course, that's not the only incident you ever experienced.
No.
Have you ever experienced any violence against you?
No, not any violence,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, that's good, but...
Yeah, thank the Lord for that.
But more just an atmosphere that you sense.
Yes. And, yeah, and, you know, and living in this country, unfortunately, at this period of time, I was in a meeting yesterday, and people talked about the fear that exists in the community because you don't know what will happen. I mean, some people may not make use of maybe sometimes the parks or the trails because they don't want to go by themselves or travel to certain places or be certain places by themselves because you never know what will happen. And that kind of fear, and because of what's happening, is just more prevalent now. Yeah.
So do you sense that it has spiked
Oh, definitely.
in the last few months? Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay.
And that's because, people have an issue when you say Black Lives Matter, but it's because we have seen things or injustices that has occurred that show that our lives doesn't really matter. And it's not that other lives don't matter, but when you look at what's been going on and the injustices over the years, on, and you think you've made a couple strides or made
Yeah.
some headways, but it comes up against you in so many different ways.
Yeah. Well, I won't put words in, well, I will put words in your mouth, but you can contradict them. I mean, you have not acted like a victim. I mean, God has
Yeah.
given you gifts. I would call you a brainiac. I mean, anybody in the sciences, to me, has got a whole brain that I don't have. But you have seen success in your life. You've been in higher education in both secular and religious realms, and done chaplaincies and done a lot of community work. Tell us about the particular area where you have a voice, and you've coined a term for it. You've called it health disparity. What is that all about? Because I didn't know about that until you told me about it.
Yeah. Well, health disparities is, and I made sure that I wouldn't mess it up. It is, so I can give you a definition. It refers to the incidence, or I should say, preventative differences in the burden of disease, injury, violence, and opportunities to achieve optimal health that we experience, especially people of color. So their disadvantages or higher burdens of health, health issues and other issues that affect people of color and indigenous population.
Can you give us an example? What are you talking about?
One of the things that impacts, there are so many different things.
Yeah.
I'm currently working at the Minnesota Department of Health, and I work in the Center for Health Equity. And and one of the things that have over 20 years now, the legislatures have provided funding for is several areas that was brought to the attention of our government within Minnesota that impacts people of color and indigenous people. And it's heart disease, it's high blood pressure, cervical and colon cancer. It is violence and unintentional injuries. It's infant mortality, and that's the area that I work in. It's
And all these are more prevalent.
more prevalent,
Yeah,
yes. And when it comes to health issues, people will say, well, why don't they eat well? Or, why don't they do this? But when the opportunity is, and one of the things that I want to say, a lot of time people talk about personal responsibility, and it's easy to say someone need to take responsibility, but when the choices that you have are limited, then those, then you, even if you make the right choice, it's very difficult. When we're talking about all these issues that impact our health, it's not just behavior of someone. And I thought I should have given this slide to Roger so they could have put it up there. But when we talk about understanding what creates health, we think about personal responsibility. But the social and economic conditions impact health outcomes much more than quote-unquote health care or someone behavior. We're talking about 40% of social, and then there's environmental health, and all those things impact health outcomes. We're talking about home ownership. In Minnesota, less than 23% of home ownership is in the African American population, compared with something like almost 60-something% for whites. Well, people will say, well, I bought my home, and why can't they do the same thing? Why don't they work and do the same thing? But when you are limited, and if we look at the history especially in Minnesota, people were barred from living in certain section of the city. People moved into certain areas, and they were taunted. Their house was destroyed, and different things have happened. So we're limited in terms of what we're able to do. And that goes back, and when we're talking about this, you say, well, that was then. But what happened then is still impacting us now. And if you think about after people returned from World War, I mean, there were all these people that wanted homes, and we were restricted as to where we could live. And you think, well, why? But it's in the federal housing, FHA. There was language in those documents, and still in some documents today, that says that do not sell to black families. So here you are, you think you came back from war and you're trying to make a home and do things for your family, but you're always bombarded by different policies in the system that keeps people, quote unquote, in place, which is very unfortunate.
Well, let's talk about something that isn't policy, but still exists.
Mm-hmm.
So why, you're working in this equity aspect, so that there's equality in service. So what?
Equality is different from equity.
Okay, school me. No, but well, let me ask you this question. So let's get real practical. So what is likely to happen, or happens way too often, when an African American person goes to a doctor? Give us an example of what you're talking about when you talk about this equity issue.
Okay, and just so I can say, equality means that everything is, you're trying to do everything the same. Equality means that you provide for individuals so that everyone can reach their best potential in health. That means when you're talking about equality, I just did a presentation recently where I showed a slide showing equality. Everyone is given the same bike, whether that person is tall, whether it's a kid, whether a person in a wheelchair, they're all given the same bike. Naturally, for the kid, the bike is too big. For the tall person, the bike is too small because his legs won't make it. But when we're talking about equality, the equity, the kid is given a small bike. The person in the wheelchair is given something that fits towards them. So it's making it possible for each person to have what's needed to make their full potential. Okay, back to your question.
Yeah. Yeah. You told me about some things that what happens in a doctor's office, for example.
Yes. One of the things that happen is when individual goes to the doctor, because of implicit bias. That means that there are ways that the doctor think about a black person that will determine how he will treat that person. Person waiting in a waiting room, and it's been documented. I know that, for the big thing in the U.S., is this documented? Yes, there are papers, there research been done on it that shows if I go to a waiting room and a white person is there, they will be seen faster. They will get questions asked. They will be given more meds if they're in pain. Just a lot of ways that blacks are treated or people of color are treated in just going to the doctor will determine their health outcomes. So because doctors, one of the things that an example is, a lot of time doctors think that black people have a high pain tolerance, so if they go to the doctor and they're even in a hospital, and it's seen over and over, especially for pregnant women, that they don't get the medication that's needed. And if then they try to advocate for themselves, then they're seen as being angry, and the treatment overall is much different if they see someone of their own race. And that's unfortunate, and it happens over and over again.
So you're working in this realm. What are some of the things that you're doing to try to bring equity?
Well, one of the things that I've been working on is infant mortality at the Department of Health. That's a project that I've been working on, and that's U.S.-born African-American infant mortality, because black babies are twice as likely to die before their first birthday than white babies. And that also is the same for indigenous population. The infant mortality rate overall for the state is 5.1. And the infant mortality rate for African American is 9.6.
Is that like per thousand or?
Per thousand. Yeah, per thousand live births. And infant mortality means that the baby dies before their first birthday. The baby's born live, but does not make it. And
So it's roughly double.
Yes. Yes. And you say, what causes this? Is it prenatal care? Is it not having the right food or things like that? And after working with the community and looking at this, the bottom line is racism that impact birth outcomes. And you're going, what? Yes, it is. Yes, there are other things that contributes to that, but what we call social determinants of health, that's one thing. As I mentioned, it's not just the behavior; it's all the other things. There is housing, there is employment, there is transportation. And housing especially is a big one. And as the weather is getting cold and we see a lot of camps in the parks, you on this side of the river may not see it as much, but there are a lot of homeless people. And with what's happening with the pandemic, more people are being evicted. For 2019, there were over 300 babies African American babies that born into homelessness. And I think it's roughly the same for
That was
American
just
Indians.
in Minneapolis?
Yes,
Yeah,
for the
okay.
state, yeah. Yes.
Well, Helen, so you have a voice in that, in an area that I'd never even thought about, and it has huge implications not only for specific medical care, but it's also talking about the sociology that underlies not only the mentality of the African American person, but also the white caregiver, if that's who that is. So there's a whole system behind that. What have you noticed in your lifetime that has been an outcome of policy that has hurt the African American community or the indigenous community as well?
Well, one of the policies that I can think of is how individuals receive or qualifies for help. It's getting a little better in terms of making sure that if someone is lacking housing or lacking what's needed, that they could use that time for, and one instance would be when someone is pregnant, they, when they apply for assistance, sometimes they're still required to work. And, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you are struggling with housing and some other issues, the requirements could be much better in terms of using that time for maybe parenting skills or other classes that would benefit mom in terms of excuse me, in terms of providing additional information to mom. And then the one thing that in my project that we have been doing is being very intentional about including fathers in the process, because over the years, some of the policies and things in place have excluded men from the homes. And you go, what? Yeah, but that's true. I mean, if we think back in the early, maybe 70s or so, when people received, it was called AFDC at that time. Here were two here was a couple, married couple, but they needed some assistance. And because they were people of color, there were certain restrictions that you could not receive any kind of governmental help if there was a man in the home. And so what that did was push a lot of the fathers out of the home. And you'd hear of stories about social workers coming in and doing the home visiting and looking to see if there's a man's shoe in the home. And if there was a man's shoe there, they would refuse any kind of assistance. And what that did was put a big divide in the family, and people says, well, oh, the man is not there and the man is not involved. Most African American men want to be involved in their families' lives, want to be a part of their kids' lives. However, because of the different things in the system that started during that time, then women start saying, okay, we can make it, we can get help, and you don't have to be here. And unfortunately, those things have persisted in a lot of different ways, continue to persist in the society.
So when the solution is, hey, we need to get fathers back into the homes. Fatherlessness is the major blight in the African American community, fatherlessness. That's not a simple, you can't just say that
Yeah.
and walk away.
Yeah.
Because we have systems in place that have actually I mean, yes, there's personal responsibility, but there are systems in place that prevent that, or that are disincentives
Yeah.
for the men to be in the home.
Yes.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, also, fatherlessness, as stated in the media a lot of time, that men are not in the home, but also they are incarcerated at a higher rate. And I thought I brought that statistic with me,
Yeah.
but I didn't.
Yeah.
But African American men are incarcerated at a much higher rate, and African American boys get put in the system so much easier than a white kid. If a just think of a teenager, and they do stupid things like go for joyride. If a kid out here go for a joyride in a car, took their aunt's car or somebody's car, they'd call the father or call the parents. The parents would come down and vouch for the child, and that was it. If an African American child does that, and I'm not condoning any of that, if an African American boy did that, teenage boy did that, he would then be in the system.
So he has a
And-
record.
Yes, he would
Yeah.
then have a record, and that would then follow him, and so that is one way of getting them in the system. And after they get in the system, then it's easier to having a record, then something else happens.
Yeah.
And also when we think about even for crimes or different things that occurs, the sentence is much higher. One of the things that has been brought to attention of a lot of people is if crack versus cocaine use over the years, we've seen that where somebody had crack, they would get a higher sentence if somebody had cocaine. And the thing is, just take time to read and to see what's really happening. And the statistics are there, and it's a matter of just really taking time to look at really what's happening and what's behind all of this. And half the time, it's just because of the color of our skin, and that shouldn't be.
Yeah.
And, as believers, we need to stand up and really say when things are not right. And it doesn't make someone less than just because of the color of their skin or their nationality. We're all, we've all sinned and come short of the glory of God, but we're all also made in the image of God. And if we look back at our history, for so long we have been seen as less than an individual. And for me, that really hurts my heart, for somebody to think that I am less than, a human being. And at the same time, we're talking about made in the image of God.
Yeah.
And so I can no longer, for me personally, I can no longer stand by and not speak up, because we're in this journey together. And we need to be able to talk about what's happening and don't shy away from it, because all these things, the underlying reason is because we see somebody less than, and it shouldn't be. Yeah.
Well, what I'm learning from you, Helen, is
Thank you.
Thank you. I can do my best to see you or anybody of any other race as a human being and in the image of God, and try to treat you with respect and honor, and as an individual. But I also need to recognize that even if I'm trying hard to do that, that does not do away with some of the things that are behind the scenes. And I may not have a voice in that, but I need to be aware that it's there.
Yes.
and and vote for people and support people who are in the system trying to correct some of these things and recognize that there's a whole history here that may not be as bad as it once was, but it still has lingering implications in our culture.
Yeah.
And so, it's not enough for me to say, well, individually, I'm not a racist. And I don't believe I am. I have a lot to learn, but I need to also recognize that there are biases behind the scenes that do need to be corrected.
Yeah.
So.
All the things that we're seeing now stem from what happened historically.
Yeah.
And so one of the things is that we need to be aware of how these things came about and how these policies was put in place, whether it's for housing or transportation or employment. African American makes less than a white person sometime in the same position. And that shouldn't be.
Yeah.
If we have the same, just like for women and men, women tend to make less than men. And just think, if we go down the poll, then when we're talking about women making less than men, then African American end up making less than their white counterpart. And this shouldn't be. And all these things stem from what has happened over history. And we need to change history. We need to do something different. We need not do just something different. We need to be specific about changing system that continues to perpetuate actions that keep someone in position so that they're not able to strive.
Well, we want to thank God that you are part of that, and you have a voice within. And I know we haven't had a chance to talk about all the things you've done with teen pregnancy and being an advocate in churches for health care and these kinds of things. And I just thank God that you are there, Helen. And it's not like, well, okay, you go do it, but I had no idea of what you were doing, how you were working within the system to bring equity in that system. And we thank God for that you are there. And maybe there's a question or two that you want to ask Helen this morning about that. Joe, is that your hand? Yeah.
Helen, thank you so much for being here. This is certainly, hopefully, a delight for all of us and a lot of education. How can myself, I don't speak for anyone else in the room, how can we support our brothers and sisters from Indigenous people of color without stepping away from us individually, without sort of stepping into organizations that we don't believe in? I think the one that came up with Lakewood recently was teachers were putting the Black Lives Matter thing in the room. And the organization is stepping away from what it says. And so how can we support the cause without stepping away, without turning our backs to organizations that we believe in, founders, history, police, while supporting our brothers and sisters across the spectrum?
Okay. That's a good question. One of the first things, and I think in conversation with Roger when we met a couple months ago, that was one question that he asked, what do we do or how can we support that? And one of the things I say is we need to start the discussion about racism and open and be honest with each other. Yes, it's painful, but if we don't begin to have the conversation to really not just talk about it, but to really begin to act differently in supporting individuals and things that really will make impact. When you say, how do you support it, but and I'm trying to see, you're saying that how do you support it in such a way that makes a difference, even if you don't agree with all the things that quote unquote Black Lives Matter is saying? Is that what is that the question? Maybe I should get,
When it comes to like erasing history, although very damaging, you'll agree with that part of it, or agree with building up, or defunding the police, or some of the other views within that, will support it, right? We'll support it 100%.
yeah, okay.
All elements, will you still support?
Okay, if you don't support all the elements of what is being said. Okay, okay, okay. Well, the one thing, the underlying thing is that Black lives do matter.
Amen.
End of story. Whether there's some other things that go along with it, and I can think of that we're all believers in Christ. And Christ is the head for many churches. However, there are doctrinal things that happen within other denomination that I don't agree with. But the one thing that do matter is that where everyone put Christ makes a difference. That's how we relate. And so I can think of you maybe thinking about it that way. That the main thing is that Black lives do matter, but maybe some of the other things that policies that go along with it that maybe you don't agree with. But the one thing is we need to just take time to ask, why do you say defund the police? Or why are you saying some other things? And maybe get an understanding. And people are not saying to put away with police. I don't think that's what they're saying. But use, because we do need police. When something happens, I want to be able to call the police and know that they're there for me. However, there are things that happen within the police department that could be, because it could be used in a different way in the community. One of the things that we see, and it happens across the country, is mental health issues, which for a long time this country have not, because we have closed all those institutions. So we do have that in our communities. How could we use social services or to actually have that be a response and not the police responding? So if somebody get raped, I want the police to be there to investigate that. If someone get robbed, I do want the police to be there. So it's really getting an understanding of what those other things are. So the main emphasis, just like how the main emphasis would be Christ, and there are some other doctrinal things that people do, but if the main thing that you can agree on, that's a starting point.
Okay, good. Any other question? We just have time for one. Yeah, right here.
Yeah, thanks.
Can you speak up so everybody can hear?
Yeah, so as far as like a practical sense of outside the church walls, what is a good way to get involved other than just like acknowledging that it's an issue? I want to put my boots on the ground and go do something about it, whether it's in the community or whatever. What does that look like for yourself? Where's the place to start?
Okay. You mentioned one thing is the practical thing is getting involved in the community. I know what happened is that most of the things seem to happen on the other side of the river. How can you be involved in some of those things that's happening and support those individuals? Maybe start talking to churches, ask about organization. I mentioned Stair Step. That's one organization that I used to work with, that work with churches. There is the Baptist Convention. There are different things. And really in your neighborhood, is there anyone that living in your neighborhood that doesn't look like you? What could be the first step? And as I said, it's just getting to know people and really having an honest conversation. If you need some leads for in the city or individuals, I think one of the things would be to, and this is just coming to me as I'm speaking now, is maybe for Ironworks is to do an exchange with some other men's group in the city and have an honest conversation about what they're facing and things that they're seeing in their own lives.
I'm thinking about in our, just a little circle of our neighborhood, we have a Sikh family, a Somali family, an Asian family, and an Indian family. Just getting to know them just in our little place has been fascinating. Well, we need to bring this to a close just because of time. I know some of you need to go and get the wheels of capitalism rolling this morning from a dead stop. But let's do this before we close. Would one person at your table just lead in a word of prayer and ask God to help us open our eyes, however the Lord would lead you, to open our eyes to what is happening, to help our own eyes be open and our culture become a much more harmonious and equitable place. And you know, it's hard for us to see things that are obviously wrong, and we didn't know anything about it, and it's been going on for a long time. It makes us feel sad and sometimes angry, but something needs to be done there, and God needs to open those eyes for us. So would somebody at your table just take a moment and lead in a word of prayer? And I want to thank you, Helen, for coming. It's a very brave thing for you to do, to be with us this morning. And there's so much more I'd like to ask you about, but we'll have to do that another time. Maybe Wednesday night. We'll ask you some other questions. So thank you very much. Guys, close your table with a word of prayer. Will you do that?